Last year, Amy and I were down here for Christmas. Those of you who were here then will remember how very warm it was at this time last year. We played croquet that day on the lawn. It was perhaps a little too cold for croquet, but we played it in order to be able to say that we had done so. It was certainly as warm on the lawn then as it was in the billiard room this morning directly after breakfast. While today I should not wonder if there was 3 feet of snow outside. More, probably. Listen. We had no frost that autumn, and one of the dahlias was still in flower. I've always thought that it must have been mad, and I wonder if I were not mad, too. While the rest of you played your half game of croquet, it struck me that it was not so warm as I had supposed, because quite suddenly I shivered, and shivering, I looked up, but I did not see anyone playing croquet at all. I saw something which had no relation to you. At least I hope not. You all know the croquet lawn, and how it is bounded all round by a flower border, with a brick wall behind it, through which there's only one gate. Well, I looked up and saw that the lawn was shrinking, and the walls closing in upon it. The rays of the sun began to fade, till it grew quite dark overhead, and only a glimmer of light came in through the gate. There was, as I told you, a dahlia in flower that day, and as this dreadful darkness and bewilderment came over me, I remember that my eyes sought it in a kind of despair, holding on to any familiar object. But it was no longer a dahlia, for at that moment the hallucination was complete. I was no longer sitting on the lawn watching croquet. Rather, I was passing through a dark enclosure of fog, or black mist. As the mist cleared, I saw that, where there had been that unseasonable dahlia, there now burned the last dim rays of dusk, and my eyes were drawn there into what I soon discovered was a graveyard. Row upon row, the tombstones glimmered faintly in the dusk, and at the far end of it, only just visible in the gathering darkness, were the roofs and small spire of a cemetery chapel. The gate was opened, and I entered, walking upon a gravel path in the direction of the chapel. The tombstones came to an end at a broad space of open grass between me and the chapel. There stood a single, solitary grave. I left the path and went to it, though it appeared rather new, glimmering with a pale sheen in the dusk. I saw that already moss and lichen had covered the face of it. I wondered whether it was the grave of some stranger who had died a lonely death, and had no friend or relation to look after it. The name, whatever it was overgrown. With some impulse of pity for this forgotten soul, I began scraping at it with my fingernails. The moss peeled off quite easily, coming away in long shreds and fibers, and presently I saw that the name was visible. As I worked, the darkness had so gathered that I could not read it. All this, I suppose, took place with the instantaneousness of a dream, for at once the whole thing had vanished, and I was back on the lawn again, dripping with perspiration and trembling all over. Now all of you may say I had fallen asleep, and had a sudden nightmare. That may be so. Shall I go on? Well, let us say for the moment that it was not a dream exactly, but a hallucination. Whichever it was, it haunted me for months. It was never quite out of my mind, but lingered somewhere in the dusk of consciousness. And as the weeks went on, the seed began to sprout that I had been daydreaming. I can't say that it actually affected my health. I did not sleep or eat insufficiently, but still I always found myself deep in some abyss of despair. I told my wife, who laughed at me, and my doctor, who laughed also, and assured me that my health was quite robust. At the time, he suggested that change of air and scene does wonders for the delusions and fancies of the imagination. And so I took a holiday in Scotland to do some hunting up in a small forest in Sutherland, very remote and wild, and not far from the sea. Sudden sea mists were common. One day my guide and I stalked a deer to a very high tableland on the limit of the forest, which went down very steeply on one side to a loch that lay below it, and gently sloping on the other to a river which ran from the loch down to my lodge. We had a dreadful climb over big boulders with deep holes between, masked by clumps of heather. We had to watch our step to avoid broken bones. The deer we'd been stalking must have smelled us out, in spite of our precautions against the wind, for it was nowhere to be seen. We ate lunch on the heather and enjoyed a well-earned smoke in the sunlight. The morning had been extraordinarily warm, with a little wind blowing off the sea. I felt an extreme sense of peace. Never since Christmas had I been so free of fear. But then my guide urged that we must move on. The weather had changed, he said. We should be off this high ground as soon as possible, he said. A sea mist would presently come up, and the crags we'd just negotiated would be a bad place to get down in a heavy mist. Fearing the mist, which was already boiling up from the sea, I felt in my pocket for the compass, but there was none to be found. We were not yet halfway down when the mist overtook us, shooting up from the valley like the broken water of a wave. In 3 minutes' time we were enveloped in a fog so thick we could barely see a dozen yards ahead. We were happy that we'd taken the gentle slope towards the river instead of maneuvering once again over the crags. But the mist grew thicker and thicker, and I got wetter in the next hour than I have ever been before or since. The wet seemed to penetrate the skin and chill our bones. And still there was no sign of the track for which I was making. Fear began to overtake me, and it was getting dark and had grown very much colder. Soon we found ourselves walking through a steady fall of snow. I heard the distant brawling of the river, which comforted me for a time. But before I had gone 100 yards in the direction of the river, I heard a sudden choked cry from behind me and saw my guide's form flying as if in terror of pursuit into the mists. I called out but got no reply. The darkness enveloped me and seemed to shield me from the snow. Then the sky suddenly grew lighter, revealing the moon, which lighted everything around me. But it was not the moon. It was the faint orange rays of dusk illuminating my path. The light smoldered with the madness of a dahlia blooming out of season, a dahlia unaware that its time has passed. The whole of my months-long terror came back to me, for I saw that the vision in the garden was again fulfilled, and once more I found myself striding into that same graveyard I'd seen on that warm Christmas. There stood the chapel with its queer little spire. There was the new gravestone covered with lichen, except now the caul of lichen was furrowed, as if partially scraped off by a man's fingernails. My fingernails. Again I saw that the name was visible, but as I worked, the darkness had gathered that I could not read it, just as before. I lit a match and held it to the surface of the stone, and the name I read there was my own. At that moment, I saw stealing towards me a tall, gaunt figure as of a man, but well over 6 feet in height, with grotesquely elongated limbs, and my soul was sick unto death. I think I tried to scream, but I could not. I know that I tried to move and could not. And it crept closer. I do not know how I found my way back to the lodge. I only know that I did. Next day I developed a chill, and as you know, pneumonia laid me on my back for 6 weeks. Well, that is my story, and there are hundreds of ways in which you can explain it. Is that all, you ask? Yes. It was nearly too much for me.
I'm Annie from Boston, Massachusetts.
And I'm Johanna from Vienna, Austria. We are the hosts of Fresh Hell, your international podcast that covers murder, mystery, and the macabre throughout history. Are you interested in the 3,569 ways your household could have killed you in the Victorian era?
Do you know how malaria and syphilis played a role in the John List family murders?
And have you ever wondered what Prince Albert's sex chair had to do with the murder of Stanford White? Okay, nothing. It had nothing to do with it. We're still telling you about it, though.
It's a pretty great sex chair. If you're looking for another show that talks about Ted Bundy, this is probably not the podcast for you. But if you're looking for two women that cover lesser-known cases from all over the world with a lot of background information.
So much background information that you will rock your local pub quiz from now on.
Then find Fresh Hell Podcast on your favorite podcast app.
We also have German cannibals.
See you soon.
Tschüss.
I'm Amanda.
And I'm Jessie, and we're the hosts of See You Next Tuesday podcast, true crime podcast where we talk about the crimes against family members.
Because let's be real, the ultimate See You Next Tuesdays in the world are the ones who commit crimes against family members.
100%. Right now we are covering a tough one, moms. But don't worry, we don't discuss the terrible crimes and leave you depressed. Before we go, we tell you about our star mom of the week that we think is killing it in motherhood.
Give us a listen on most podcast platforms, Spotify, SoundCloud, Apple, Google, Stitcher, and more. Don't forget to like and subscribe. As always, we will see you next Tuesday.
Hey there, friend. My name's Sarai, and I host a spooky, casual podcast called Freaky AF, where I tell you stories of conspiracies, true crime, and of the supernatural. So if that's your kind of shiz, come check us out. I'm sure we'll be great friends. You can listen to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Spreaker, and a bunch of other places. Or you can look us up on Twitter and Instagram. We're Freaky AF Pod. That's FREAKYAFPOD. Come get spooked, y'all.
I'm Edward October. For more true, true-ish, and classic tales of horror and the paranormal, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Be sure to ring the bell so you don't miss anything. Or find all of our links at octoberpodvhs.com. Octoberpod, retro horror for bold individualists.